Thank you. Kind of looking out in the audience before we started, it reminded me of flying to Las Vegas. Everyone was kind of happy, and at the end they're like, "Oh, I lost all my money." And well, hopefully it won't be that way. Who am I? Some of you know who I am, but let me give you a little bit of who I am and why I'm here. I'm from Wisconsin. I kind of grew up getting the environmental signals that to make a lot of money was the best way to have a girlfriend and a car and an apartment, and so I went and studied business. I worked on Wall Street for a while. My job was to manage money for billionaires. My first job after MBA school was to cold call people that had $100 million or more. And you would cold call 50 of them, and you'd get 5 meetings, and you'd get 1 client. And so at a very young age, I saw the richest people in the world go through the daily motions of their lives. And I was fortunate to learn that someone that had $300 million said, when I get to 400, I'm quitting. But when they got to 400, their buddies had 800 or 900. And it was the feelings they got every day when they woke up that were driving them, not the money. The money itself was just a marker. And they were stressed, and I remember they would call me from the delivery room when their grandson was being born. "What's IBM stock doing?" And it was, it just struck me as, wait a minute, I thought money was so that you could enjoy those things. So I was fortunate to be exposed to that situation when I was young, and I eventually kind of started reading books, Daniel Quinn, Ishmael, Bill McKibben's End of Nature, and in the late 90s I started to have kind of an epiphany, and in 2002 I gave my clients their money back, and I quit, and I traveled around the world for 2 years with a backpack of books, Herman Daly, and the whole ecological economics. And so basically for the last 10 years, full time, I've been reading and learning about the interconnected issues that face humanity. So why am I here tonight? Well, there's a proximate reason and an ultimate reason. Proximate and ultimate, the proximate reason that geese fly south in winter is because it's warmer. The ultimate reason is because they get the neurotransmitter cues that lead to higher foraging opportunities. So the proximate reason I'm here is to make an impact on Minnesota and the future of our species and our culture. And the ultimate reason I'm here is to raise my social status and increase my mating opportunities. I didn't expect you to laugh, but I said that on purpose because in that statement is a little bit of truth. And in that statement also is a juxtaposition of one of the core problems we face, which is individual behavior looking out for themselves and altruistic behavior of our aggregate collective. And they're totally battling, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit tonight, and it's always present, that battle. So what I'm going to try and do is first talk about first principles. How does the human ecosystem really run? Which is maybe a little bit different than we're taught in the textbooks. And then I'm going to talk about a synthesis of how that fits with the present and the future of our society. And then per Kurt's suggestion, I've added quite a bit, right or wrong. They're my own thoughts on what we as individuals can be doing. I'm going to talk about what I'm doing, what can you be doing, what can Minnesota be doing. So I've got a lot of slides, and I'm going to go relatively fast, and there'll be room at the end for questions. So first I'm going to talk about energy. Energy is the primary driver of organisms, ecosystems, life in nature, including our system. A cheetah expends a certain amount of energy to get an antelope. If he expended more energy than was in the antelope, he would quickly die or not have offspring, etc. So it's the surplus energy available to the cheetah and other species is what allows for proliferation. So this is no different in the human system. There's nothing in our economies that generates GDP, or economic growth, that doesn't first have an energy conversion. No matter how you make a cup, from a coconut or from ceramic or plastic or steel, you first need energy. Energy is the master resource. If you think back to several hundred years ago, we would use the energy from the sun combined with the soil and other natural elements, rain, to produce a surplus. And we use that surplus to feed people that were employed elsewhere, et cetera. Energy has always been central in human societies. In fact, when we talk about GDP, or what most people on Wall Street or Bloomberg or CNBC talk about economic growth, it's really just a proxy for energy use. This graph shows over the last 30-some years, the light blue line is primary energy, the red line is GDP, and useful energy, which is things that directly do work, like electricity, is almost exactly correlated with GDP. So standard economics says that's wrong, that all that really matters is capital and labor, or population. But energy is special. Everything on this page costs around $100. But the oil, the energy embodied in that barrel of oil, is 5.7 million BTUs, or about 1,700 kilowatt hours of potential work. Now, the average American, or me, digging potatoes or pushing wheelbarrows, generates around 0.6 of a kilowatt hour per 9-hour workday. So if you extrapolate that out, 1 barrel of oil supplants around 11 years of human labor. The average American salary is $44,000 a year. So it's almost $500,000 of human labor substituted from this 200 million year old condensed ancient microorganisms, et cetera, that we're pulling from the ground. So that is the driver of industrial civilization, is fossil carbon. The average American uses around 60 barrel of oil equivalents of coal, oil, and natural gas. So if you think about that subsidy, we literally have hundreds of fossil slaves standing behind us. They don't speak, they don't complain, but we recently discovered they poop and they breathe, which is a problem. By the way, before I get too far, how many have heard, how many came to my Earth Day talk a couple months ago? Okay, so some people. It's kind of like a Grateful Dead concert. There's some old songs and there's like a new album. So, okay, so here is kind of an example of the energy density, how we've allowed to use incredibly energy dense fuels. I'm about 1/10 of a horse. That is my horse, my draft horse. That's our utility vehicle, which is 45 horse, and that's our truck, which is 150 horse. So our current civilization is incredibly energy dense fuels, move things around the world. And this amount of diesel fuel will power that truck 7 miles down a road. So imagine how many humans it would take to push that truck, even if what if it was uphill? I mean, there are some things that doesn't matter how many hundreds of humans it would take, you can't do it. So it's pretty much indistinguishable from magic and any human timescale. Okay, so here's a Midwest example. What we've done is we've added huge amounts inefficient energy to processes that humans used to do before. And the reason that we can do huge amounts and do them inefficiently is because energy's been unbelievably cheap. So take, for example, milking cows. So if you manually milk a cow, it takes basically 30 minutes per human per cow per day, 0 external energy, and the salary is $3 an hour. There's semi-automated milking machines, which reduce the human time in half to 15 minutes a day. They use 300 kilowatt hours per cow, and that raises the wage to $5 an hour, or reduces the price of milk, or increases the profits of the owner. And then there's the fully automated that the cow just kind of goes through and gets milked, and that's only 3 minutes per day per human, but it uses a lot more energy, and it also has a lot higher wages. So as you can see, there are many processes like these that humans used to do themselves. We used to walk. Now we take a car. When you take a car, you use, depending on the boundaries, 200, 300, 400 times more energy than walking, but it gets you there 10 times faster. So this whole dynamic has powered us through the last 100-some years. So, well, in economics, outsourcing to more cheap locations and better technology has resulted in things getting cheaper over time. But energy is different. It follows more of a bathtub curve than a toaster. Toaster, are made in the Philippines or wherever, that they're incredibly cheap because of cost of labor and other things. But fossil carbon has gotten more expensive. We used to input 1 barrel of oil to get 100 back in the 1930s. By the 1970s, we had to drill offshore. That ratio went down to 30 to 1. About 14 years ago, the ratio was in the 11 to 17 ratio, and anecdotally now it's in the single digits. We're spending more of the energy to get the same amount of energy out. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So how does technology work then? Technology is actually a vector to use more energy. Think about the development of, for example, a lawnmower. All of a sudden, everyone wants a lawnmower, and you're selling all these lawnmowers. More diesel fuel needs to go in the lawnmowers. And the same thing with these time-saving devices on the gadgetry. Between 12 and 15% of our US energy is devoted to servers, internet servers, et cetera. And I read somewhere that 10% of internet traffic is related to cats, so like 2%, do the math. But anyway, so all these technology that makes us use more energy, and then we end up having these time-saving devices. We end up watching TV for 3 hours or doing, internet. So it's kind of weird. Okay, so this is a graph of global energy mix over the last 200 years. The beige part on the bottom is biomass, which is mostly trees. I did a tour when I was studying in the University of Vermont. That entire state was clear-cut in the 1860s. Why? Because people needed it for fuel and to build houses and such. But then we started to find coal, which is the gray, and then oil and natural gas, the green and the red. Hydro is the dark blue, nuclear is the light blue, and renewables can hardly be seen on here in the yellow. I'm going to show this graph again later after the human behavior part and tell you what those letters mean. So oil, there's plenty of oil, but it's getting more expensive. This is just a graph showing some of the capital expenditure increases for some of the major companies and flat to declining production. The graph on the left is just focus on the yellow line. The yellow line is the extraction cost, break-even extraction cost plus capital expenditures and dividends for the major oil companies, the biggest ones in the world. In 2000, it was $9, and it's gone up 17% a year, and now the break-even for next year is $120. That includes dividends and such. So the red and the black line show how much we produced. So yes, we are increasing our production a little bit, but it's costing a lot. We hear that the US is going to overtake Saudi Arabia. We literally have hundreds of years of fossil fuels in the ground. That is technically true. Oops, I wanted to go to this one first. So a lion might see this and say, holy crap, I'm rich in wildebeest, but it's a little bit different to actually immediately go and get one. There's a cost. So this is US oil production since 1945, and you can see, yes, there has been a major increase of late. The tight oil in North Dakota and some other shale plays. But this is not newly discovered oil. This is oil that was found a long time ago when oil was $5 or $10. And the fact that it's $100 now is why people can develop it. So if we look back to the slides I had earlier, it's not how much energy we have, it's the benefits that it throws off to society. And I'll return to that thought. So this is prices for the last 30 years for Europe, which is a little more closer to the world average because of natural gas. The bottom is coal, the middle is natural gas, and crude oil is the top. So even at today's prices, we are 2 to 4 times higher than the historical trend. As something that throws off as much benefits as it does, that means that this energy inefficient process of adding 1,000 or 5,000 units of energy to replace human labor has a problem because it's now getting more expensive. So if energy costs 5% of our GDP, in other words, 5% is spent drilling for oil and building solar panels and extracting coal, we have 19 benefits left for Disneyland and NASCAR and Minnesota College of Arts and Design, hospitals, et cetera. But if energy extraction costs, not in dollar terms, but in energy terms, increase or double to 10% of GDP, which is where I think they're headed, then we only have 9 benefits left. So somehow those benefits need to be, something goes away. Okay, so that was energy. Now I'm moving on to money and finance. So what is money? Money is lots of things. I would define it as a claim, since energy drives our societies, I think. I think money is a claim on future energy. If you get paid today, it might be a claim 2 hours from now because you're going to go buy a dinner and some clothes, so it's not that much in the future. But you could have money in the bank and try and spend it 20 years from now, and it's a claim on that energy that will be powering society then. Money is really a marker for real capital. It's just a marker. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. And what is real capital? Ecological economics will tell you it's these 4 things. Natural capital, which is trees and healthy ecosystems and fields and soil. That's my backyard, by the way. Social capital, which is our friends, our networks, our relationships. In this case, my 2 dogs. Built capital, which is the things that we use natural resources and energy to create, like this building or this microphone. In this case, it's my house with some solar PV and some chainsaws and an aloe vera plant and a grill. And all that is built capital. And then there's human capital, which is our skills and our knowledge and our health. That's me identifying a large edible hen of the woods mushroom. That's my dad. He knows how to fix people's broken knees and legs and also plants vegetables, though he complains a lot about it. So this is what money represents. So in the past, when we had money, we could get maybe a loan because if someone was planting crops and they had land a couple 100, 300 years ago or whatever, well, clearly they have the land and then clearly they're going to get a crop, so I'll give you some money for that ahead of time because I know I'm going to get paid back. The loan was backed by natural resources. This has often been the case until around 1970 when we decoupled from the gold standard. Every currency in the world right now is not backed by anything. Any natural resource. So I was going to choose either Bart Simpson or Alan Greenspan, and at the last minute I chose Alan Greenspan. So money, this is how money creation works. And I have an MBA in finance, and I was not taught this at University of Chicago. When you go, you sir, I'm going to use you as an example, when you go to get a loan from a local bank in Minneapolis, Bremer Bank, you look respectable, you just got a haircut, your resume looks fine. We think you're credit worthy. We're going to give you $500,000 for your new business. At that moment, something really interesting happens. $500,000 shows up in your checking account, and at the same time, a $500,000 asset shows up on the bank's account. So from the bank's perspective, nothing has happened. because you owe them $500,000 plus interest. But from a system perspective, what has happened is you could immediately spend that $500,000 on anything you want. You're probably going to do it in your business, but you don't have to. Nowhere else in the system did $500,000 of purchasing power leave. So this was the way that the Federal Reserve came into existence. And for most of America's history, this was great, because we had so many natural resources here and so many ambitious, creative people that wanted to develop something and build something and extract something, that we needed more money. We had a shortage of money relative to natural resources. But something changed in around the 1970s. The graph on the left shows the black line of US GDP and the red line of our total debt, which is government, corporate, individual, household, not financial, because financial debt is offsetting in most cases. So what happened was we started to develop more and more claims on future energy and resources, and because they looked plentiful. That's what's in our textbooks. On the right side of the graph is something reflective of debt productivity, which is debt doesn't have to be a bad thing, but if you add $1 of debt and you only get 50 cents back at the end of the year from your productive venture, that's not sustainable. So you can see debt productivity declining from almost 1 50 years ago to almost 0 now. When it's 0, what are you doing? You're adding debt just to break even on GDP, and what you're really doing then is you're transmuting wealth into income. And that's kind of what we're doing. Not fully, but we're kind of doing that. So it's not just the United States. Every country in the world is following this model. Debt productivities are, between 0.2 and 0.6 on other countries, and we're doing this at a faster rate. So let's think about that just briefly. If a helicopter or a series of them came over Minneapolis and dropped $5 billion of cash, what would happen? Some people would scramble with backpacks and they would get $1 million or $2 million, and gradually would be mostly gone, and there would be some people that got 10 grand or $500 or whatever. In that moment, a lot of people would be driving SUVs or going to Tahiti or building new condos on Lake of the Woods or things like this. But nothing happened to energy and resources in the time being, except that all of a sudden they were more affordable and more people wanted to do stuff that gave them a good time or whatever. So this is kind of what's happening right now with global sovereign central banks. The Federal Reserve is buying 50% of our debt. They just buy it directly. It doesn't go to the open market, they buy it. They're buying, at least as of last year, they were buying 100% of new mortgage issuance. I'll get to that a little later, the implications. So basically a micro and macro lens for debt. What does debt mean? Well, from a micro lens, it means that there is a debtor and a creditor. In that sense, it's a zero-sum game. And in that sense, it means that someone's getting all the chips and the wealth inequality is increasing. In a macro sense, it's a Ponzi scheme because we're creating more and more claims on a static amount of resources. Okay, getting from the boring to the more interesting parts of the talk. We are risen apes, not fallen angels. And I know that may sound controversial to some people, but this is our family tree. We share 98% DNA with, those were pygmy chimps, also called bonobos, 90% with a cow, 80% with a cat, 70% with a mouse, 60% with a fruit fly, 50% with a banana, etc. We are kindred to every living thing on the planet. There was a new paper out this week that showed that actually 99% of our genes predate primate evolution of 50 million years ago. And there are only 19,000 workable genes in the human genome. And all these things that we thought were workable proteins, the actually it works on gene regulation. And the difference between us and a mouse is only 10 workable genes. That's the new hypothesis. So it's stunning, but we are related to everything on the planet. It may not be, the more you delve into it, it may not be that unbelievable, but in America, it's somewhat unbelievable. So why do I bring this up? Because in order to address what's facing us on the energy and the environmental side, not only as a species do we need to know where we came from, but as individuals, we need to know. You can read psychology and sociology and see how people react, and that literature is fine, but unless you know the core drivers of how this happened, it's not as robust of an explanation. So Homo sapiens evolved in a period of scarcity on the Pleistocene. So the things that drive us today are, I'm going to talk about in a second, called supernormal stimuli, which is things that didn't exist in our ancestral environment, but now we see them. So we basically have three regions of the brain. We have the reptilian core system, we have the neomammalian system, and then we have the neocortex, which is our thinking, doing homework, doing mortgage payments, etc. Now they all three work in concert optimally, but sometimes the older regions of the brain kind of go off and do their own thing involuntarily. Okay, that worked on her. So you know that Kurt is not going to invite some crazy guy here. But what that was doing is her neocortex was listening to what I was saying, but then her fight or flight response couldn't help but move. And so these things are happening to us all the time. Okay, steep discount rates. So science has shown that if we emit a certain amount of CO2, it will impact the biosphere. And actually, they're quite sure that it's human-caused and that it's an urgent problem. And actually, they're 95% sure, and we better do something about it. And we actually have less time than we thought, and we need to get on this problem. Hey, were you a little bit worried about that? Did you see something? No, let's just go have a pizza and some beers. Holy crap, Godzilla's in Minneapolis. So this is an example of how humans have two modes, complacency or panic. And we thank you all for coming here tonight because you all, whatever else you had to do tonight, you deferred that to come and listen to this, and that's a positive sign. But basically, we value the present, and some of us much more than others, much more than we value the future. And this also has evolutionary origins. If you think about organisms that found food and deferred it for the future, they would have been outcompeted by organisms that ate it right away. So there's something called a discount rate. A discount rate is a number from 0 to 1, and it's a measure of how much you prefer the present to the future. Now, a discount rate of 0 would be like a robot. A robot would not care about the year 2500 the same as today. But a discount rate of 1 would be like a goldfish would care about the present as the same as the future. If you feed a goldfish and you're going out of town 3 days of food, it'll eat everything right away and like blow up. I'll skip that part on the bottom. So this is, I mean, how many high school students are asking what their grandkids like? They're like, yeah, let's party. I want to get a job and a car. They're not thinking about the biosphere and ocean acidification, and can we blame them? This is natural human response, is to focus on the future. Now, there are people that are addicts, risk takers, drug users, drinkers, have steeper discount rates than others. Men have steeper discount rates than women. So there are various demographics, and Americans have steeper discount rates than some other countries. Okay, status, sexual selection. So in nature, there is competition for resources, and competition for mates, and competition for resources for offspring. And for example, a peacock has to eat bugs and other things to have nutrients and minerals to grow this giant ornate tail. And that's a cost to him. It's also more conspicuous to a predator, and it's also less likely he can get away. And all those negative hits are offset by the female peahen's preference for such a display. There's such a thing in nature called the handicap principle, which actually suggests that waste has been evolutionarily selected for. So we can see this manifest in the human sphere as well. Every year you'll read that they're building a new yacht that's 7 feet larger than the previous yacht that was the record. And, I've cajoled with these people, and it's just kind of funny to see the dynamics. They don't realize it. It's like they have like a nail in their head, and they're like, I'm going to see this nice yacht. And they don't realize how kind of ostentatious it is. Anyways, so this is a very fascinating line of research. In nature, we don't so much care about absolute return, but relative return. We're trying to move up the mating ladder, not ostensibly, we don't think about it that way, but we do things that give us the same feelings that our ancestors got when we were moving up the mating ladder. This example, would you prefer a 4,000 square foot house in a neighborhood of 6,000 square foot houses? Or would you prefer a smaller house, a 3,000 square foot house, in a neighborhood where all the other houses were smaller? Most people would prefer the smaller house as long as it was bigger than their neighbors. And it's funny, but this is like at the core of resource overconsumption, is we're trying to keep up with the Joneses. And we almost catch them, but we don't. And we almost catch them, and if we did catch them, we'd realize that Jones is an idiot. But Chinese and Indians are trying to live like Americans. And so we're sending them this signal. So in nature, there is a automatic negative feedback to overconsumption of resources and status markers. For example, a lion could not possibly get that third gazelle down. His gullet would be full. A deer antlers couldn't be much larger than that, or he would fall over. But in human society, there's a positive feedback. More money begets more addiction, etc. Not always, but a lot of times, yes, we do things because we can, and then we do more of them. So supernormal stimuli, habituation, and addiction. I'll just quickly read this to you. It's by this great guy, Stuart McMillan. The instincts have no bounds. Instead of stopping at a sweet spot, the instinctive response would still be produced by unrealistic stimuli. Once the researchers, this is Nikolai Tinbergen, a human ethologist, once the researchers isolated the instinct trigger, they could create greatly exaggerated dummies which the animals would choose instead of a realistic alternative. And they've done this in all sorts of animals. Songbird parents would prefer to feed fake baby birds with mouths wider and redder than the real chicks. And the real chicks themselves would ignore their parents to beg fake beaks with more dramatic markings. This is called a supernormal stimuli. And I'm sure you can imagine the ones that exist in our society. Well, let me give you an example of the mechanism, how this works. So this is a now dated study with chimpanzees that were thirsty, and they put headphones that would play a tone, and when the tone was played, they would get a squirt of fruit juice. And they measured their dopamine neurons. Dopamine is part of the neurotransmitter reward pathways in our brain. Like when you see something that you didn't expect, you get a shot of dopamine. So the monkey's neurons went from dopamine neurons went from 3 to 60 in a second. They were like, whoa, that was great. I didn't expect it. That was really cool. And then they kept doing it, and it kind of gradually went down. They still liked it. But after like 10 or 15 times, squirt of fruit juice, I expected that. No big deal. Dopamine neurons were 3. They very quickly became habituated to something that was once good, but now they got used to. And the feelings of feel good, whoa, were no longer there. So the wanting in our species feels better than the having, and that is a problem for energy and climate change. The dopamine system is stronger than the opioid system, which is feel good. Real quickly, dopamine, Parkinson's disease is a lack of dopamine in a certain area of the brain. And Mayo Clinic did this study on like 100 Parkinson's patients. They give them a drug called Mirapex, which boosts dopamine all over the brain, and it helps with Parkinson's symptoms. but it's like surplus dopamine in the reward areas. And all of a sudden there was these church pastors that had like 7 affairs, and this little old lady lost $150,000 at the Indian casino gambling. And it was all sorts of consumptive behavior that previously didn't exist because of more dopamine. So we think about this, our own behavior, where we are faced with choices every day, a good choice and a less good choice. Exercise, watch TV, a salad or a burger, homework or a video game, save the climate or go to Tahiti. And when our neural rewards, kind of like the monkey, when they get ratcheted up, our decisions get slanted downward towards the negative choice just a little bit at a time. And eventually we have a repertoire of these things. Okay, so cognitive biases. So optimism is very adaptive. And I'm sure you've all heard some of the statistics. 99.9% of high school seniors say that they're better than average at getting along with other people. 90-some% of college professors think they're better than average. If you think about why that is, you know to say, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not. It's better for you to have that fake sense of reality. And so optimism gives you a reduction in cortisol. It boosts your helper T cells, which is an immune system. So to think on the bright side of things is adaptive. It's the natural way of things. So there's all sorts of cognitive biases. One is called cognitive load. I'd love to spend like a whole hour talking about them because they're fascinating. Cognitive load is the ability to hold 6 or 7 chunks at most in your mind at one time. And after 7, your efficacy drops down considerably. The reason I bring it up is because the things I'm talking about tonight, there's so many, but yet for me to leave some of them out, then you don't get the full picture of what's happening. And I've noticed this in myself. I was like researching for this talk a couple days ago, and I found a really cool article. I'm like, God, this is really good. I didn't know that. And I wrote it 6 years ago. And it's like you can't keep it all. We have 1,300 cc's, and you just can't keep it all. And so what I'm most expert in right now is the stuff that I've read the last month, because stuff that was last year is just gone. I mean, I retain a little bit of it, but yeah. So our brain, we don't have like one consciousness. Our brain is like a lunar module. We have all kinds of domains that were meant for different purposes, and they're all working at the same time, whichever one shouts louder. Eliot Spitzer condemned prostitution like terribly as a moral wrong. That part of his brain did that, but another part of his brain did something else, and we all do those sort of things. We can't imagine what it's like to be sexually aroused when we're not sexually aroused. We can't imagine how depressed we are when we're super happy. It's your brain thinks in the moment on what's important at the moment. So consciousness and how we rationally think about things is not really what we think. Okay, so I told you about cognitive load. There are more biases. There are actually hundreds of biases. And I think the human brain is at the core of our energy and environmental problems. Everyone in this room has a belief about the world. And you believe that very strongly. Or relatively strongly, because if you believed what I believe, then it wouldn't be your belief. We all feel very strongly about things. They might be different things. Some things like climate change are incredibly polarizing. And I'm sure everyone in this room knows some people that think climate change is a hoax or whatever, and there's no fact in the world that would change their mind about that. No way. It's a belief. And when you say, I believe humans are causing climate change and it's something to worry about, the area in the front of your brain lights up the same way that a sister in the church would say, I believe in God. When we believe, It's the same areas of your brain that are activated. So this man is one of the smartest men on the planet, far smarter than me. But Stephen Hawking thinks that the answer to climate change is for us to colonize Mars. So there are ways that we can be incredibly brilliant but delusional. And I actually saw this bumper sticker in Hawaii, and I do think this is right. Humans are delusional. We can be not delusional at times. Like the Manhattan Project, we work together towards something. But going through our day, we are very confident about things, and we're really off base most of the time. We're delusional. Now, delusional is not a bad thing, right? It's helpful. It helps us get through life. It's being delusional about being delusional is the problem. So I'm nearing the end of the human behavior part of the talk, but there's something else that's not really human behavior, but it's part of behavior in nature that I wanted to talk a little bit about. And some people consider it the fourth law of thermodynamics, which is called the maximum power principle, which suggests that organisms and ecosystems self-organize so as to maximize their ability to degrade, harvest, consume an energy source. So trees will grow in such a way so that the leaves get the maximum amount of sunlight they can. Here's kind of a long quote. I'll read it because I think it's profound. What took place in the early 1500s was truly exceptional, something that had never happened before and never will again. Two cultural experiments running in isolation for 15,000 years at last came face to face. Amazingly, after all that time, each could recognize the other institutions. When Cortez landed in Mexico, he found roads, canals, cities, palaces, schools, law courts, markets, irrigation works, kings, priests, temples, peasants, artisans, armies, astronomers, merchants, sports, theater, art, music, and books. High civilization, differing in detail but alike in essentials, had evolved independently on both sides of the earth. Those civilizations had never come in contact. Yet all those things came up and self-organized in order to access resources and develop political hierarchy. If you think about that, it's really profound. Humans are what's considered an eusocial species, which is mega social. We do things not just like a solitary wolf, but we do things in a group. Another eusocial species is the social insects, ants, hymenoptera, wasps, etc. So this is a leaf-cutting ant, and they farm leaves that grow a little fungus on it, and they eat that. And there's all different castes, but basically for 80 million years, they've been a successfully stable species. They are the one species that by weight equals humans on the planet, termites and ants. I'm going to come back to that a little later, but basically I would hypothesize that human society is kind of like a Borg. Despite what we individually choose, there's this pursuing onward of the hungry hippo of more energy and more resources. This is kind of a key part of my talk, but I have so much in here that I didn't really have a lot other than this core quote, which is by evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson. Selfishness beats altruism within groups. Altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Everything else is commentary. And this is, again, like I said in my intro, kind of the core of what we face is we are group creatures. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're helpful to our group. It might mean that we're really negative towards an out-group. So it's either helping our in-group or ostracizing and penalizing or going to war with the out-group. That is a history of all the way back to tribal times, how humans were. Okay, quick summary of human behavior. We value the present disproportionately more than the future via steep discount rates. We easily become distracted by and habituated to readily available novelty. Via natural selection, we are programmed to compete for relative status and resources by whatever metric our current environment dictates. Cognitive biases, our brains are like Swiss Army knives. We are not sentient or sapient in aggregate, but follow the momentum of the hive. So when we are born, we have all of this genetic baggage, but from that moment on, we're not gene fitness maximizers. We don't go out and try and have a lot of kids and get a lot of resources. We're adaptation executors. We look around for our cultural cues. What are other people doing? How will I gain status? So the way that we're gaining status now doesn't always have to be the way. And the currency, of course, is neurotransmitters. We're not doing what our ancestors did. We're getting the same brain chemicals that our ancestors did. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the things that are readily available shout louder to us than biodiversity, climate change, peak oil. Those things are way in the future. They don't shout as loudly. Okay, synthesis. Where does this bring us? So this is a summary of the human ecosystem. We turn energy and resources into dollars. We turn dollars into feelings and waste. And I haven't talked about waste, so I'm going to do that now briefly. I would assume that 80% of this audience is relatively fluent in climate change, so I'm just going to have a few observations that you might not have heard or my take. By the way, I'm not trained in climate. I think it's horribly complex, on top of things I already think are complex. I know 2 or 3 people that think climate is run away and humans are going extinct by 2050. I know 6 people personally that think humans have a very, very small role in climate and it's all a political thing. Probably all of those people are wrong. The truth is somewhere in the middle, but I don't know. I also know 8 or 9 people that were IPCC authors, and they are between moderately and extremely concerned. So that's where I hang my hat with what they say, as I'm sure most of you, unless there's some climate scientists in here. So this is the purple and blue is parts per million of CO2. The green line is the pH of the ocean, which is a logarithmic scale, and it has not declined that quickly in, I think, 20 million years. It's been a long time since it's declined that sharply. So this is the latest IPCC forecast of Celsius temperature rise in the next 100 years or 85 years, based on various scenarios. Given what I've studied in energy, I think the top few scenarios are not going to happen because we don't have enough economically affordable fossil carbon to meet those. Now, there could be some things that are positive feedbacks that aren't in. I mean, I don't know if IPCC is conservative or aggressive. I mean, it could be either. I don't think we know. But I don't think that there's that much carbon available. However, we could have a coal seam fire in China that burns out of control for 100 years. That's not in the models. So there's all kinds of, we just don't know. It's so huge, and the risks are so scary. By the way, for those that don't know, if we do have 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, it's largely game over. It's very, very bad for the oceans, for life on Earth. And basically, in times past, some of the great extinctions we know were from large carbon pulses from various sources. So there was a summary for policymakers report in Science this week, and some of the things didn't show up in the IPCC report. This is the first sentence of that report. A central finding of WG3 is that growth of income has been the single largest driver of emissions. Of course, I can imagine why they didn't want to include that. You can see here the blue line is carbon emissions per year. Slight little flat period in the 2007 recession, but marches onward. Now, one thing I think is all climate models that you read in the news stop at 2100, as if that's all we care about. So a lot of the carbon will continue to have impacts for thousands of years. So when we're talking about reducing our carbon budget, if that's what we choose to do, it's not for the next 20 years, it's for the next 500 or more. That is a major, major implication. But once I die, say in 2050, 2051 to 2551 mean the same to me. We have to keep the biosphere intact, if possible. Just real quickly, this was in Science this week. If the U.S. goes it alone and follows the EPA carbon reduction guidelines, this is what it does to CO2 by the year 2100, temperature change, virtually nothing. So it implies that, if it's going to happen, it's got to be an international effort. It's not just climate and ocean acidification. Humans are appropriating, depending on the boundaries, between 20 and 40% of the net primary productivity of the planet. And there are lots of other species. This is a graph of, since 1950, all kinds of kind of asymptotic graphs, exponential growth of all sorts of resource use. And I've got more to say, so I won't dwell on that. So in the 1970s, 90% of the food in Minneapolis was grown within 100 miles. And so in addition to going to debt in a big way in the last 40 years, we've also gone to globalization and created a bigger mousetrap. And the complexity of our system is unbelievable. We have a tsunami in Japan, and 10 days later, Ford can't produce black trucks in Detroit because the pigment was made there. So a lot of our food might be produced in Minnesota, but the packaging and the distribution and the wrappers and the labeling and all those things are produced all over the world. So there's 7 billion humans alive now, and if you weigh them all, dry weight, and if you weigh all of our livestock, our pigs, our cows, our chickens, etc., and you contrast that to wild animals, we outweigh wild animals 50 to 1, humans and our food supply, which I found that out like 4 or 5 months ago, and I felt like I was punched. I mean, I figured it was bad, but so getting back to what I said before, up until period A, we developed, we added more and more energy to an undeveloped world. And the energy conversions benefited us greatly. Then energy started to get more expensive in the 70s. We had a dry rehearsal of the issues we're facing today, and we went to debt in a big way. So period B was debt and globalization. Debt and globalization were the way that the hungry hippo could have more energy. Period C was when kind of the market collapsed, and since then it's been on life support with central banks and sovereign guarantees, too big to fail, buying our own debt, etc. Period D now is where the government is changing the definitions of what GDP is to make things look a little better. And so I call that Orwellian productivity. Basically, right now, we're feeling the same reaction that we did when we found out about Santa. Ooh, I better not say there were some kids here. But so growth is already over for most people. If you look at the last 11 years, only the top 5% of Americans are making more money than they did 10 years ago. So all the other demographics are making less. And the lowest 20% are making 10% less, and that's with higher costs on a lot of things. And this is, at the same time, we have below inflation interest rates, direct liquidity to institutions, too big to fail guarantees, government deficit spending, all kinds of central bank balance sheet tricks. All these things are temporary. But I think if any one of them was removed, we would be back to 2008 situation. So our economic pie, the energy that goes into it is the red. It's the main ingredient. If we print money or have more expensive energy, we can keep the pie the same size, but we're kind of, the ingredients got more expensive, and that means less benefits to people. So if you think about GDP as the green line, there's also negatives that Herman Daly says we've reached uneconomic growth a long time ago. If you count prisons and natural disaster expenses and all kinds of negative things, we've already passed the end of growth, and genuine progress indicator suggests that well-being from that measure peaked in 1973. So what does the future mean? I don't know. I'm pretty sure that business as usual is in its dying throes. I think there's lots of possibilities on what could happen. The most likely is that the government's going to continue to get bigger and control more things. So I know a lot of people here are renewable energy advocates. I am as well, but under a unique context, which I'm going to talk about under the solutions part. I think the fact that solar has gotten so much cheaper is distracting people a little bit because any combination of renewables and more expensive fossil fuels has to be cheap enough in order to meet the claims on the future that we've already created. So I don't believe that any combination of the energy mix we have right now is cheap enough to continue this. Maybe that's a good thing. So this is the absolute growth, not the total, but the absolute growth since 1990 of renewables. The blue is wind, the yellow is solar. Coal is the black, natural gas, red, and oil. So what can solar really do? It can do two things. One, and that's what it's doing now, is it can extend fossil industrial civilization for 20, 30, 40 years. Because when we use solar and wind, we're saving on the fuel that we don't have to burn. It can also be the foundation for a completely different society that's renewable based. But if it's 24/7 electricity, which semiconductor plants, microprocessors need that, there needs to be fossil backup or hydro or pump storage or something like that. So energy is not 1 BTU equals 1 BTU. There are energy properties involved. And solar is wonderful, but it's not just a plug and play, let's get rid of coal and natural gas and go to solar and everything continues on the same way. I'm going to skip that due to time constraints. So what's happening? Well, what's happening is we kind of feel what I'm saying. We feel what's going on. We feel the end of growth. The S&P is very high. There's full restaurants in Minneapolis, but we know something's wrong. Our natural human proclivity is to blame someone. The Chinese, the Republicans, the environmentalists, etc. Now here's our human behavior thing again. Steep discount rates, when we can't think about the distant future, also work in reverse, and they're called the recency effect. So I'm happy that all of you came here, given that the S&P is at like 1940, what's to worry about? We're getting the wrong signals because that is an indicator of the supply and demand for securities, not a signal of the health of the future. So in the red period in 2007, 2008, everyone was, well, what's going on? How does the debt, energy, and oh my God, what do I do? And now it's like kind of like a sitcom to watch and learn a little bit about, unless you're really worried about climate, then it's a different story. But in other words, we wait to see the crisis before we do something, and that's a problem. So the maximum power principle, et cetera, us saying we need to tighten our belts and reduce our consumption and do something about the environment, we're wackos. We're having people move. Why would we move away from these rich feeding grounds of coal, oil, and natural gas? Are you crazy? So that's why social status matters on these things, because there's a ceiling on how far we can publicly. That's one of the reasons I like doing these talks, because you're kind of my tribe. I feel like I can say what I feel and I won't be ridiculed. So when you see things like this, and this just hit me this week too, when you see news headlines like this, natural gas claimed as a bridge to clean energy future. This was today. Australia could slash its carbon emissions to 0 by 2050. Neonicotinoids blamed for colony collapse disorder. These are scientific facts or statements that you would say, oh yeah, those will lead to action. What they do is they actually just cause our social status seeking thing to create groups. We email these to people that we know might be interested, and it's just kind of an assortative grouping thing, when it should be, holy shit, look at this, science is telling us about these problems, but it's different. Sorry about the swear word. So I'm almost done with the synthesis part. I know I'm kind of going overly long, but I do have some good stuff yet ahead. So a very good friend of mine last week called me a green troll because I care about 100 years from now or 200 years from now. And it struck me that as the economy rolls over, that along with socialism and atheism, environmentalism might be a bad word in this country. And it's kind of scary because this is really kind of our nest. That's one of the most important things. But people are going to be so focused on those brain chemicals shouting the loudest that some hypothetical thing in 2050 or 2550 is probably going to lose out. I don't know. So when I was in graduate school, they taught us that when we got our MBAs, we would be cleaner fish. We would go out and make the economy run smoother. And it took me a while to learn that they turned from cleaner fish to barracudas, maybe not quite that bad. But finance is what we're optimizing now. We're optimizing money instead of these other things. And when you optimize one variable, all kinds of other things go haywire. And so right now, we measure our worth by our digits. Maybe not the people in this room, but that's the cultural signal that we're sending. So there has been quite a bit of sociological research on the correlation between wealth and well-being and happiness. And it turns out that after you've got your basic needs met, which turns out in this case around $55,000 a year, that up until that point you have major increases in well-being because you were starving, you were stressed, you were cognitively waiting for your next paycheck and worried. But once you got to that level, your additional happiness increases were very small. And I saw this at a young age with these billionaire clients. So environmental success stories in the past had a smoking gun, chlorofluorocarbon, DDT, unleaded gasoline. We saw the problem. Climate, ocean acidification, it's more like Russian roulette than a smoking gun because it's like one chance in what, or is it going to be really bad? We don't know. I'm going to skip that. So in addition to equity, let me go back to that. So a lot of people are talking about more equality. And more equality, I would argue, is probably not a good thing for climate and ocean acidification. It depends what you want to optimize. If you want to optimize the lives of everyone alive today, and what equality are we talking about? Americans? Or if we were talking about world equality, most of us would have to have reductions to have people in India and Africa. Africa's in worse shape than they were 20 years ago. So if everyone had enough to buy refrigerators, a car, and an air conditioner on the planet, we would be in big trouble on the environmental front. So that's one thing that I've found in working in this space is everyone is well-intended and very passionate about their thing. But their thing, how it fits into the greater whole, it's not quite so simple. So if we talk about this graph, what about all the people that are yet to be born? Maybe we should aspire to have 1 trillion humans. We have 100 billion have ever lived, including the 7 billion now. What if that's something we aspire to? What are we leaving for them? And that's not how we're genetically focused to think about. What about other ecosystems and species? What is the equity with them? So I did a study of well-being, percent very happy on the left, subjective well-being, versus primary energy use on the bottom. So the US uses twice the energy of Netherlands. We're about the same amount of happiness. We use 38 times the energy as the average Filipino, yet we're roughly as happy. This gets back to the bigger house than the neighbors sort of thing. If you have a good social structure and some guarantees about healthcare and whatever, you don't need all this jetting around the world to get your novelty, et cetera. So kind of this is, there's some good news in this graph. And the good news is that the average American consumes around 3,500 calories a day of endosomatic, in the body, consumption. But our energy footprint is 235,000 calories, about 90 times more. So that means the car that drove me here and the lights, all that added up per person is 90 times more than the energy our bodies need. So that's kind of good news in that when I grew up in the 70s in Wisconsin, I used a third of the energy people then used a third of the energy as they use now. And I had a great childhood. So the problem is how to get from here to there. But certainly we have a lot of positive trajectories that are possible. Okay, conclusions before I get to the what to do part. Money is a marker for energy. Energy is what we have to spend. For most people, growth is already over. No shortage of energy, but a longage of expectations. There is plenty of energy out there, but it's getting more costly and more polluting. So what we really have is not enough energy to meet this. Biology determines what we need. Culture determines how we get it. A lower consumption, more local and regional future is not only needed, but probably desirable. What sort of future do we want? What are we willing to give up? And on some key risks, seeing a smoking gun might be too late. Okay, what to do? So what to do depends on what you care about. A lot of people in this room very much care about climate. But we also care about economy and jobs and social equity and future generations, et cetera. So before I suggest what we all should be doing, I'll briefly tell you a few things that I'm doing. I'm working with Stanford University on a net energy protocol, which is to measure our wealth in energy and natural resource terms instead of in dollar terms, to have an inventory and an open source protocol to make decisions in energy terms. And by the way, if the people don't know, I will be teaching at University of Minnesota in the fall, a class called Collapse or Sustainability, ? First Principles of the Human Ecosystem. And it's basically going to be a 15-week expose of everything I've told you tonight. So I'm working along with some friend in the audience that I see is here on a poverty initiative with 25 philanthropic representatives on maybe our plans, the Congressional Budget Office plans of 3% growth to the future aren't going to manifest. And if they don't, maybe our campaigns and our programs of what we have invested in and planned for need to be changed. And what if we have this or worse? How are we going to deal with poor people, existing poor people, and the people that are going to join the ranks of the poor? I also founded something called the Bottleneck Foundation, which is not trying to think about the next 5 or 10 years, but thinking about what sort of ecosystems, what sort of knowledge, what sort of infrastructure, what sort of values we want to propel into the deep future. I plant around 40% of my own food, and that may sound cool, but like 30% of my own food last year was potatoes. I had 13 bushels of potatoes, and I put on 30 pounds because I had potatoes 9 times a week. And I try to be a better person. I try to be not so serious because this stuff can really be toxic, and just be, who I could be, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. What can you be doing? Well, the best thing you could be doing, the best thing is denial. That would probably be the healthiest thing for you, is to not know anything I've just said. But the fact that you're here, that's not an option. So what I've done is I've created 3 areas of the risks that we face. We face environmental problems, biodiversity, other species, climate, ocean acidification, pollution, et cetera. We face issues related to the end of growth, which are mostly economic. How are we going to function, structure, thrive? And even if there were no environmental or economic issues, I would argue that we're facing a crisis of overconsumption. We have the most obese, most medicated, most armed nation in the history of the world is where we live. And that's a problem. So I would argue that there are certain responses that would fit in these various buckets. Some of you may take issue with this. I believe that efficiency and renewables and divestment aren't helping the environment. Those are helping Minnesota. They're helping local organizations. Divestment will be great for taking your money out of Exxon and putting it into some Stillwater food thing with kids and whatever, local projects. That makes total sense. But the hungry hippo marches on, and it's not going to save, that Exxon stock's going to be bought up 5 cents cheaper by some hedge funds. And unless you personally divest from the fossil fuel use, the emissions aren't going to stop there. The same thing with efficiency. Efficiency is wonderful and very, very important. But as long as economic growth globally is the carrot that we pursue, efficiency is just going to lead to 6 more feet of cement per person in China. So until we change the carrot away from optimizing finance and money, these things actually make things worse a little bit. So that's not to say we shouldn't do them, because we need to do them to have the expertise and the technology and to get ready, but in and of themselves, they don't help the environment per se. So what I'm going to talk about for the last 10 minutes or so of my talk are the things that you can do that will fit in all 3 of these risks. Okay, what to do? First of all, embrace life. This is my dog. He turned 11 yesterday. He's my best friend. My 2 dogs before that were also golden retrievers. They died of cancer when they were 6 and then when they were 7. And since he's been 7, he's got these lipomas on him and whatever, and I've been worried. I'd never in my wildest dreams thought he would make it to 11. We went looking for rocks today, went for a hike. My reason for bringing this up is I've been reducing the wonder of my relationship with him because of my fear that he was going to die prematurely for the last 5 years. So extrapolating that to what we're talking about today is there's some scary possibilities. And we have to say, okay, yeah, financial collapse, runaway climate change, systemic problems. We have to recognize that they exist, but that they're really probably smaller than we think. And we need to say there's not a lot we can do about those things. I'm quartering it off, and I'm focusing on the 90% positive trajectories that are likely. At least that's my attitude. What to do? Assert control. So this is a physiological test that was done, back to the human behavior stuff, where they had a bunch of people test, and the experimenter turned a knob, and the faster the knob went, the faster these colors whipped in front of the person, and they had to press red, green. And he kept turning it faster, and then they measured the blood and did an interview after. And they asked the people, what did you think of that? That was hard. I was really stressed. And in fact, their blood cortisol showed that they had high amounts of stress. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Then they did the study where people could control themselves the magnitude of the speed. They were turning the knob and pressing it, turning the knob and pressing it. They turned it even farther ahead than the other experiment. And they interviewed people. The cortisol was totally level. They got dopamine. They were excited about it. They're like, that was challenging. That was fun. Can I do that again? The message here is, knowing what you know about the likely future, you need to change some of your circumstances so that you're in control. Because if you're responding to what happens, you're going to have that same sort of stress hormone response. So I don't know what exactly that is, but I think that's important. Okay, what to do? Think, act in terms of real capital. So 90% of the things that we value in life are real capital, natural capital, social, built, human. 90% of what we measure in our net worth are digits, artificial markers. So to start to understand that and maybe go a little bit in that direction, Kurt and some other people here, and you might be involved, are doing a Minnesota divestment where they're divesting from fossil fuels in their 401ks and investing in local opportunities for a local economy. That is changing financial capital into real local capital. Take back language. So in the movie Elephant Man, he said, I am not an elephant, I am a man. And I kind of feel the same way, that I am not a consumer. I'm a human being. And I was born into a consumer era of our species, but I'm more than a consumer. I have a lot of other attributes. And I think to say things using language is very important. Another suggestion I would have is fossil fuels. We're giving the other side total license once they've won already when we call them fossil fuels. The technical name is fossil carbon. It's only a fuel once we discovered it and decided to use as fuel. So there's all sorts of examples like that where we frame things via language. What to do? Learn something new, learn something old. I think we're on this parallel path of Google and more technology and things like that, and that's good, but because of that, our Piggly Wiggly and our econos act as our root sellers, and we're forgetting all kinds of skills that our grandparents had. And I'm not saying to go back to the Dark Ages, but I'm saying to have some balance. And we have a draft horse, and we're trying to learn how to do this thing in the upper left, and oh my God. But we're trying, and we have a root cellar, and they're like small machine repair. It doesn't have to be all Middle Ages stuff, but there are skills that we've lost. Give something up. So if we're not headed on the blue line, but if we're headed more on the red line, there will be some things that will be unavailable, especially if you don't have a lot of money. And I think to get ahead of that, instead of having some massive Leatherman Swiss Army knife, we just have a simpler one. If you try and list all the things that you use in 1 week, the list is insanely long. So I'm trying to give up a few things forever, every year. And if I happen to cheat because I'm at an airport and there's no other choice, I'm not going to, be depressed. But I'm gradually trying to simplify. Know thy reptile. So we get our brain chemicals in ways that we're very habituated to. You go to the refrigerator at 11 p.m. and there's a tub of Hagens in there. You're not starving. You're plenty healthy, but it's the feelings that you want. And I'm thinking that to change the way that we get our dopamine and serotonin or whatever is an individual thing. It requires discipline and forethought. So my advice to you in knowing thy reptile is to just count to 10 when you know you're about to do something that is a supernormal stimuli and maybe not the best long-term decision. Just count to 10. And if you really want that Haagen-Dazs, that's fine, but at least be aware of how our brains work and how we're being hijacked in this consumer culture. And maybe shift things back up one notch. So one thing that I've been doing, my friend Peter here is also an aficionado. I did not know that where we live, I live by Red Wing, is like one of the agate capitals of the world. So I get the same dopamine that I used to get from doing a big commission stock trade or playing in a poker tournament from, whoa, I found an agate. And I found my first one 3 months ago, and I'm totally addicted to it. Now, the only people that's hurting is people that might want to find agates 100 years from now, but I think that's kind of a minor thing. And this is something I just discovered. There's something called a stromatolite, which is 2.5 billion year old organism, the first living organism on the planet, the prokaryotic forms in the ocean. Where are they found? In Minnesota. Mary Ellen Jasper. This is Jasper with these stromatolites in it. This is like really cool, so I'm like constantly on the search for that. Okay, buy solar. Everyone in here should buy solar, but not only as supply. Think about it a little bit deeper. Where we're headed, I don't know about the next 10 years, but in the next 100 years, individuals are probably headed towards more intermittent energy. It's unavoidable. I mean, even if the tight oil lasts 30 or 40 years, we're eventually going to go 100% renewables. I actually think renewable energy on an intermittent scale is more attuned to the way our brains work than constant 24/7. If it's windy or if it's sunny, we go out and do work, and if it's raining and not, we play parcheesi or do something else. And I think, back in Holland, they did that. So I think it's really interesting to think about, and this is a little bit too, weird, but I think we need to, let me go to the next slide. So I have a solar oven. My dad has a solar oven. My dad has plenty of money. And we didn't do tomatoes one day. I wrote a blog post on this. And he came home and he's like, "You didn't do tomatoes? Damn it, we wasted a day of sunlight." And I thought that was the coolest thing, that my dad said that there was sun that day and we didn't use it. We didn't use the solar oven. So these solar ovens are a couple $100, but just think about what you're doing by that. You're not turning on your stove. Anyways, I'm very pro solar, and I think everyone in this room should turn some financial capital into some energy capital. Either if you don't have anywhere to put it, just keep them. For the future, but we need to invest in energy in Minnesota, and the more people that have that, the better. Okay, personally divest. Not exactly that, but if you just take the mindset that what we have is indistinguishable from magic, and you really value when you're going on an airplane ride or when you're going on a car ride, and just appreciate it. And also make some choices. Like I've used so many fossil fuels in my life, it's not even funny. I don't use that money anymore, but what I really consciously do is if I've got a bunch of errands to do, I wait until I have 6 to do. And I go all in one day to do them. Little things like that. Because if we don't personally and again, I'm trying to get in that triangle. This is good for you as a person, and it's good for the local resilience because you're not as dependent on it, and it's good for climate and keeping carbon in the ground. Choose your tribe. I think we are incredibly social creatures, and this is kind of what my workstation used to look like on Wall Street, and there was guys stacked up. The guy next to me makes $20,000 on a commission, and I made $3,000, and I felt like a total loser. And I think to surround yourself with people of your own values and things that you care about is very important. It's something that you can do. A friend of mine is in the audience here, Jim Patterson, told his daughter, because he's concerned about these issues, he said, "Sweetie, the train is running out of control and is driven by sociopaths. You cannot change that. What you can do is choose who's on the dining car with you." And I think not only telling your daughter that, but telling people in this crowd that it does make sense. You have a choice on who you can hang out with, and it makes a difference. I've spent almost all my money. I live on $45,000 a year now, and I've never been happier because I've surrounded myself with people that care about the right things, and there's dynamic interaction with people like you that are learning about what's really important. So as long as I have enough money to pay the bills, I don't need any more. Be pro-social. There's an instinct, of course, when we hear about these risks to go the guns and gold route. And I think really the bug out place that we should be working on is Minnesota, not guns or gold in our basement. So we have to kind of, I kind of went that way for a while, and then I realized, man, if this all changes and goes down, what if I break my leg? I mean, we need a doctor, you need all kinds of things. So we're kind of like all in it together. And I think that's important. So finally, like yourself. And I think we have 2 paths, like I started this talk by saying, that there is an emergent property. We could have the dark path, which is the maximum power, where we just consume things to oblivion and take other species with us. But the other one is where we realize what our ancestral past shaped us. We realize the science and the morality of who we are and how we got here, and that we want to pass something, some emergent property of the good side of humanity forward. And I think this is kind of a graph I just made this afternoon. You can tell I was in a little bit of a rush, but the bottom is from left to right is time. Just say the 1960s it started to now. And what you see is that political acceptance, the environmental crisis and economic cues, when they go up, a little bit later in time, you get some political acceptance. But all the time, the more time that goes by, our energy and environmental situation deteriorates. So as individuals, we can decide to step in ahead of that trajectory. And I do think that we are facing really good and evil. And this is, there's this new thing where they see a Prius and they go by it and they roll coal, it's called. And, I think, yeah, your reaction is the same as mine. This is kind of evil, I think. Partly ignorant, but partly evil. And this is the not evil. This is good. So I think liking yourself, the reason I brought this up is I occasionally wonder in my hypnagogic state between sleeping and waking what it would be like on my deathbed. And it inspires me because I don't want to waste my life. I want to like myself when I'm on my deathbed. But in order to like yourself when you die, you have to like yourself when you're alive. And so you have to work towards that. And for me, I am kind of like who I am. I will not stand for 10 billion humans and a lot of economic growth, but the ocean full of slimes and jellyfish and a lot of species dead in 30 years. That will not be a success. That will be horrific to me. So I really do think that the battle coming up could be between business and ecology. And I know we're going to be the underdogs, but I know which side I'm going to fight on. And I think, liking yourself could be the result of coherent life decisions based on something larger than yourself that has meaning. That is, you like yourself not because of some mental tricks, but because you actually no longer have dissonance with what you stand for versus what you are. And I think this concept of liking yourself, it's not really a shallow thing, but it's an emergent property due to being respectful in your own eyes by fairly tough, non-delusional standards. And I think deep strength that springs from self-respect and a core patriotism towards the world. And for me, these things on the left that shout loudly money and sex and food, now I get the same feelings from some of the things I attribute to the sacredness of nature, the sacredness of what we share the planet with when I was born, and that's going away. So I think, not to pick on Alan Greenspan, but I actually think what we value, what we need more now than intelligence is an alien perspective, to look at things slightly differently and not get caught up in all the same monkey trap that we're part of. So this is just a real quick example of how we might aspire to something different. This is a bowhead whale. They live over 200 years. We're spending all of our money trying to go to other planets and whatever, and there's species in the ocean that we don't even understand. So if I had a child, and I don't, I think I would want them, instead of wanting to build skyscrapers, to go research maybe a 250-year-old species. And getting very close to the end here, if someone's drowning, if you're the only one that knows how to swim, then you're on the call. So I do think that each of us can kind of breathe life into our parallel self and like that person. And if one of you in this room kind of manifests in sort of a eco-Jedi superhero, I will have done my job tonight. I've spoken way too long, so I'm going to skip this till the questions. In closing, when I was in my teens and 20s, I looked for things with more dopamine and more novelty. In my 20s and 30s, I looked for people with more money. In my 30s and early 40s, I looked for people with more knowledge. And now I'm trying to look for people that have higher values and standards. So there could be a great future in this place, different but great. Let's get started.